The change always began with a thaw. Not a pleasant one, like ice yielding to spring, but the agonizing return of circulation to a limb left too long in the cold. It started in his fingers and toes, a pins and needles fire that crawled inward, chasing the deep, settled chill from his bones. His lungs, which for 29 days were instruments of social mimicry, seized with a sudden, desperate need for air. The phantom beat in his chest stuttered, then found a real and clumsy rhythm, a frantic drum against his ribs. For Leander, who had not had a pulse since the fall of the Byzantine Empire, it felt like dying in reverse. Tonight, the transition happened in the back of a car that smelled of old leather and ozone, parked 2 blocks from the coast. He leaned his head against the cool glass, eyes closed, and endured it. The sharpening of pain, the dulling of his senses, from crystalline clarity to the blurry, muffled input of a mortal man. The world went from a symphony of heartbeats, distant conversations, and the scent of blood in 1,000 capillaries, to a simple, overwhelming wash of sound. The surf, the traffic, the tinny music from a passing car. The hunger, the constant, managed thrum for blood, vanished. In its place bloomed a different kind of emptiness. A hollow, gnawing need for food. He was human. For the next 12 hours, he was just a man. He was Leo. Leander straightened, flexing fingers that felt thick and clumsy. He ran a hand over the rough stubble on his jaw. He'd had his driver, a taciturn vampire named Alec, rough him up a bit before sunset. A faded shirt, worn jeans, a day's growth of beard, and the network of old scars that decorated his skin, some from battles a century dead, one from a near-fatal encounter with the sun in the 1920s, all looked different on a man who breathed. On a vampire, they were history etched in stone. On a human, they were just damage. They made him look tired. They made him look approachable. "The wallet," he said, his voice a rough baritone, stripped of its usual resonant stillness. Alec, from the driver's seat, passed back a worn leather wallet without a word. It contained $200 in cash, a fake driver's license with the name Leo Cars, and no credit cards. A ghost's identity for a man playing pretend. "I will be back before sunrise," Leander said, the words a familiar promise. Alec simply nodded, his gaze fixed forward. He'd been with Leander for 80 years. He understood the ritual. He didn't have to approve. The salt air hit him the moment he stepped out of the car. It was sharp and wet and alive, clinging to his clothes and his skin. He took a deep breath, a real one, and held it, feeling the simple, miraculous expansion of his chest. This was the first gift of the full moon. The air, the cold, the feeling of the wind on his face. He walked toward the distant glow of the pier, a moth drawn to a string of temporary lights. The Ocean Crest Night Market was a weekly chaos of tourists and locals, a sprawling collection of tents and food trucks huddled against the Pacific. The air was thick with the competing smells of fried dough, grilled meat, kettle corn, and the sea. It was overwhelming, a sensory assault that would have been excruciating in his other form. As Leo, it was just life. It was glorious. He moved through the crowd with a purpose that belied his casual appearance. He ignored the jewelry stalls, the t-shirt vendors, the woman selling seashell wind chimes. His destination was always the same. Tucked away at the far end of the pier, where the crowds thinned and the sound of the waves was louder than the chatter, was a small booth lit by a single string of bare, warm-toned bulbs. And under them, there was Rowan. She was there tonight, her back to him, arranging a new set of mugs on a tiered wooden shelf. Her hair was a messy braid of dark blonde shot through with threads of silver from the lights, and she wore a paint-splattered apron over a thick wool sweater. He stopped a few feet away, content to just watch for a moment. This was the second gift, watching her, unseen. For 6 months, 12 full moons, he had come here. The first time had been an accident. He'd been newly cursed, reeling from the shock of his own heartbeat, and had wandered into the market seeking noise and distraction. He'd stumbled upon her booth, a quiet island in the sea of noise, and found himself captivated by the sight of her hands, steady and sure, shaping clay on a small, portable wheel she sometimes brought with her. He'd bought a mug that night, a simple, heavy thing glazed in the blue of a deep ocean. He had no use for it. His home was a penthouse that overlooked the city, a place of clean lines and curated emptiness where nothing was ever out of place. But the mug felt good in his human hand. It felt solid. He'd come back the next month, and the next. He became Leo, the quiet, scarred man who showed up once a month, always bought one piece of pottery, and asked her what he should eat. She'd look him over, her gaze thoughtful, and give a solemn recommendation. The carnitas tacos from the green truck. They're messy, but they're worth it. Or, try the apple cider donuts. You look like you could use something warm. She was building a version of him in her head from these 12 brief nights. A lonely, perhaps troubled man who found a small comfort in her art and her advice. And she wasn't wrong. He was lonely. He was troubled. But the scale of it was something she could never imagine. He was falling for the woman who saw a simple man and offered him a simple kindness. And worse, he was falling for the man he became in her presence. Leo was uncomplicated. Leo could feel the warmth of a mug, taste the spice in a taco, feel the chill of the night air. Leo could imagine a life where his biggest problem was what to have for dinner. Leander, the vampire who commanded a territory spanning 3 states, who had outlived empires and loves he could barely allow himself to remember, could not. He stepped forward, the wooden planks of the pier groaning under his weight. "Evening, Rowan." She turned, and a smile bloomed on her face, immediate and genuine. It transformed her. Her eyes, a warm hazel, crinkled at the corners. "Leo, you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," he said. The simple truth of it felt like a confession. "New stuff tonight?" she said, gesturing to the shelves. Her hands were smudged with dried clay, the nails short and practical. "I've been playing with a darker glaze, more stormy." He let his gaze drift over the pottery, mugs, bowls, vases, all in shades of charcoal, deep indigo, and moss green. They were beautiful. They felt like the coast on an overcast day, like his own existence. He reached out, his clumsy human fingers tracing the rim of a bowl. The ceramic was cool, slightly rough. A real texture. "They're good," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm glad you think so." She watched his hand on the bowl, a small, unreadable expression on her face. "You're the only one who ever looks at them like you're actually seeing them. Most people just want to know if their dishwasher's safe." He pulled his hand back, feeling a strange jolt of self-consciousness. "They are, though, right?" She laughed, a low, warm sound that felt like a physical touch. "Yes, Leo, they're dishwasher safe." She leaned against her display table, crossing her arms. The pose was casual, but her attention was entirely on him. "So, what's the verdict tonight? What are you in the mood for?" This was their ritual. He considered it seriously, looking out at the glittering chaos of the market. "Something fried," he decided, "and probably bad for me." She nodded, her expression grave as a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "The garlic fries from the red trailer. They're a cardiac event in a paper boat. You'll love them." "Garlic fries it is." He reached for his wallet, pulling out a 20, and a mug, the dark blue one, on the top shelf. It was nearly identical to the one he'd bought 3 months ago. He had a small secret collection now, hidden in a cabinet in his vast, unused kitchen. 12 mugs for 12 nights, a rosary of his humanity. She wrapped it carefully in newspaper, her movements economical and precise. Her knuckles were smudged with paint. He found the detail unbearably intimate. He wanted to ask her about her week, what she did when she wasn't here, if she was happy. But Leo wouldn't ask that. Leo was quiet. Leo kept his distance. The questions belonged to Leander, and Leander had no place here. "Here you go," she said, handing him the wrapped mug and his change. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt of simple, human warmth shot up his arm. He hadn't felt another person's body heat in 30 days. It was so startlingly, terrifyingly pleasant that he almost flinched. "Thank you." The words were inadequate. "Enjoy the fries," she said, her smile softening. "And try not to think about your cholesterol." He gave her a small nod, a ghost of a smile touching his own lips, and turned away, the wrapped mug feeling like a fragile treasure in his hand. He walked toward the red trailer, his heart thumping a steady, reassuring rhythm in his chest. The night was cold, the market was loud, and for a few hours, he was just a man with a new mug and a recommendation for greasy food. It was, he thought, the closest he'd ever come to peace. He ate the fries sitting on a bench at the very end of the pier, his legs dangling over the dark, churning water. They were exactly as she'd described, hot, greasy, aggressively seasoned. He ate them slowly, savoring the burn of the garlic, the salt on his lips, the simple, satisfying weight in his stomach. As a vampire, he could appreciate the bouquet of a vintage blood type, the subtle notes of adrenaline or peace in a donor's pulse. But it was a connoisseur's appreciation, intellectual and detached. This was different. This was visceral. This was hunger being met. When he was finished, he wiped his greasy hands on a napkin and walked back the way he came. He always made one more pass by her booth before he left, a silent goodbye she never saw. But as he approached the spot, his stomach tightened with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the fries. The string of warm lights was gone. The shelves were bare, folded flat against the back of the tent. Rowan was packing the last of her inventory into a cardboard box, her movements quick and efficient. Another vendor, a man who sold driftwood sculptures, was helping her break down the frame of her tent. She was leaving. Early. He stopped, hidden in the shadow of a larger tent. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the warm haze of the evening. This was not part of the ritual. She always stayed until the market closed, until the last of the tourists had straggled away. He watched as she taped the box shut, said something to the driftwood vendor, and then pulled a dolly from behind the folded table. She loaded her boxes onto it, her face set in a look of tired determination he'd never seen before. She wasn't smiling. He had to say something. He had to ask. But what would Leo say? Why are you leaving? Where are you going? Will I see you next month? The questions were too needy, too desperate. They belonged to Leander, the ancient creature who had just found something worth being human for and was now watching it get packed into a box. He stayed frozen in the shadows, a coward in a mortal body, and watched her wheel her life's work away down the pier. He watched until her silhouette was swallowed by the crowd, until the space where her booth had been was just an empty patch of wood, indistinguishable from the rest. The wrapped mug in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The night, which had been a gift, turned brittle and cold around him. The sounds of the market were abrasive now, the smells nauseating. The human heart in his chest, which had been a comfort, now beat a frantic, panicked rhythm against his ribs, a ticking clock counting down the seconds of a night that had been ruined. He was losing her. He didn't even know her name beyond Rowan. He had no address, no phone number. She was a ghost who appeared once a month, and she had just vanished. He stood there for a long time, the tide of people flowing around him, until the cold wasn't just the sea air anymore. It was the old, familiar chill seeping back in from the edges of his soul. Sunrise was still hours away, but his human night was over. The transition back was of violence, a slow-motion seizure as his body remembered its true nature. The clumsy, warm heart stuttered and failed. The lungs emptied a final useless breath and fell still. The fire in his veins extinguished, replaced by the profound internal cold that was his baseline. His senses, muffled for hours, exploded outward. He could hear the frantic heartbeat of a gull on a piling 50 yards away, smell the faint trace of fear on a child who had lost their mother in the crowd, see the individual dust motes dancing in the beam of a distant spotlight. The gnawing ache in his stomach was gone, replaced by the deep, patient thrum of the true hunger. He was Leander again, and he was furious. He stood in the empty space where her booth had been, the world now a screaming cacophony of sensory data he had to consciously filter into silence. The wrapped mug was still in his hand. He held it with an unnatural stillness, his grip precise, aware that the slightest increase in pressure would shatter it into dust. Alec was waiting in the car, engine silent. He didn't look up as Leander slid into the back seat, but the tension in the car shifted. Alec could feel his sovereign's cold rage radiating off him like heat from asphalt. "Home," Leander said. The word was clipped, hard. His voice had regained its resonance, the unnerving stillness of a predator. He stared out the window as the city slid by, a blur of neon and shadow. The joy of the past few hours had curdled into a specific, targeted desperation. He had allowed himself a small, fragile happiness, and the universe had casually snatched it away. For centuries, he had survived by wanting nothing, by holding nothing close. It was safer. The last 6 months had been a lapse in judgment, a foolish indulgence. He looked down at the object in his hands. He carefully unwrapped the newspaper. The mug was a deep, stormy blue, almost black in the dim light of the car. It felt alien in his cold hand now, a relic from another man's life. He would not lose her. The thought was not a hope, it was a command. Leo, the quiet, helpless man, might have accepted this loss. Leander would not. Leo was bound by the rules of human interaction, by propriety and circumstance. Leander had no such constraints. He had built a network over 300 years, an intricate web of information, influence, and coercion that spanned the continent. He had eyes in every city, ears in every corridor of power. He had toppled governments, manipulated markets, and erased histories, all to maintain the quiet, sunless peace of his existence. It was, he thought with a grim, humorless twist of his lips, utterly absurd that he was about to deploy this entire apparatus to locate a single pottery vendor from a coastal night market. When they reached his penthouse, a sprawling space of glass and steel at the apex of the city's tallest residential tower, he walked straight to his office. The room was his sanctum, dominated by a desk of polished obsidian and a wall of monitors that were currently dark. The air was cool and still, filtered and silent. His collection of 12 mugs, hidden away in a kitchen cabinet, felt a world away. He picked up a secure phone, a piece of technology he loathed, but acknowledged as necessary, and dialed a number from memory. It rang once before it was answered. Julian. "Leander." The voice on the other end was smooth, amused, and just as ancient as his own. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Did you finally misplace a century and need me to help you find it?" Julian was perhaps the only person Leander considered a friend. They had met in Paris in 1788, two predators navigating the coming storm, and had maintained a contentious, begrudging alliance ever since. Julian controlled the information trade. If a secret had a price, Julian knew it. "I need you to find someone," Leander said, cutting through the pleasantries. "Oh, this is new," Julian purred. Not, "I need you to make someone disappear." Not, "I need you to erase a paper trail." You need to find someone. Is it a rogue fledgling? A hunter sniffing too close to your precious territory? This sounds delightfully dramatic. Leander closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had known this would be unbearable. "She's a mortal." There was a pause on the other end of the line, pregnant with Julian's burgeoning delight. "A mortal," he repeated slowly, savoring the word. Leander the austere, the untouchable, the man who treats human relationships like a communicable disease, is looking for a mortal. Do tell me everything. Is she a brilliant scientist? A political dissident? The last living heir to a fortune you wish to acquire? "She sells pottery," Leander said, the words tasting like ash. The silence that followed was longer this time. Leander could practically hear the gears turning in Julian's mind, the slow dawning of exquisite, world-class amusement. Then came the sound. It was a low chuckle at first, which quickly escalated into a full, unrestrained laugh. It was the sound of a man who had just been handed the greatest gift he could imagine. "Pottery," Julian finally managed to gasp, his voice choked with laughter. "You're using me, to find a woman who makes earthenware. Forgive me, I need a moment." The sheer, unadulterated banality is breathtaking. It's a masterpiece. Julian, Leander warned, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. No, let me have this, Julian said, still chuckling. After 200 years of your tedious monastic self-denial, you have finally developed a fixation, and it's on an artisan. This is better than the time you tried to broker peace between the Chicago covens and accidentally started a war over a hat. What's her name, this titan of ceramics? Rowan, Leander said through gritted teeth. I don't have a last name. She works at the Ocean Crest night market. Or she did. She wasn't there tonight. Ocean Crest? Julian's tone shifted slightly, a hint of genuine surprise creeping in. That's quaint. You, on a pier? With the tourists and the fried food? What on earth were you doing there? Leander hesitated. The curse was a secret he guarded jealously. Only Alec knew its full extent. But Julian was the best, and the best required data. I have business there, periodically. Periodically, Julian echoed, his voice dripping with insinuation. Of course you do. Mysterious, periodic pottery business. It all makes perfect sense. He sighed dramatically. All right, Leander. Against my better judgment, and because the story alone is worth my fee, I'll find your potter. Rowan. No last name. Ocean Crest Night Market. Sells mugs and things. Anything else? Distinguishing features? A charming smudge of clay on her nose? Just find her, Leander said, and hung up before Julian could mock him further. He stood in the silent office, the phone heavy in his hand. He had set in motion a machine far too powerful for its purpose. It was like using a guillotine to slice bread. But the cold knot of panic in his gut had not eased. He had exposed a corner of his secret life to the one person most likely to use it against him for sport. He had admitted to a vulnerability. All for a woman who knew him as Leo, a man who didn't really exist. The next 3 nights were a study in controlled patience. Leander went through the motions of his existence. He managed his territory, settled a dispute between 2 younger vampires over feeding rights in a downtown district, and consumed the sterile, prepackaged blood bags that constituted his diet. But beneath the surface of his calm, a frantic energy hummed. Every passing hour felt like a failure. He found himself staring at the city lights, trying to guess which small, anonymous window held Rowan, sleeping and unaware of the ridiculous supernatural manhunt she had inspired. He avoided Julian's calls, which came twice a day like clockwork. He knew they would be filled with taunts and feigned sympathy. On the 4th night, a simple encrypted text message appeared on his secure phone. It contained only an address and a name. Rowan Chase, The Clay Pot, 417 Westleaf Avenue. Leander stared at the address. Westleaf Avenue. It was in a quiet, arts-focused neighborhood on the other side of the city, a place of small independent shops and old brick buildings. The Clay Pot. A studio? A store? Relief washed through him, so potent it was almost dizzying. It was followed immediately by a fresh wave of anxiety. What now? He couldn't just appear there. Leander couldn't, but Leo could. But Leo's next appearance wasn't scheduled for another 26 days. The idea of waiting that long was physically painful. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to go there now, to see for himself that she was real, that she was safe. But what would he say? How would he explain how he'd found her? Leo, the shy, infrequent customer, would have no logical way of tracking her down. The lie of his identity was a cage of his own making. His phone rang. It was Julian. This time, he answered. You're welcome, Julian said, without preamble. Thank you, Leander replied, his voice flat. Oh, don't sound so thrilled. It was tragically easy. She filed a new business license last week, moved from a transient vendor permit to a brick-and-mortar lease. It seems your potter is moving up in the world. Took my associate all of 5 minutes in the city database. I'm almost insulted you thought this was a challenge. I'll transfer the payment, Leander said. Keep your money, Julian said, a thread of genuine curiosity in his voice now. Consider it a retainer. I want to see how this plays out. And Leander, a word of caution. I gave you her name. Only you. But information has gravity. The fact that you searched for a mortal at all leaves a trace, however faint, and traces attract attention. Be careful whose attention you attract. Noted, Leander said, and hung up. Julian's words settled over him. Traces attract attention. He looked at his own hand, pale and still, resting on the obsidian desk. He could punch through this desk. He could tear a steel door from its hinges. He could stop a heart with a careless squeeze. And he wanted to get closer to a woman whose bones would snap like twigs in his grasp. He couldn't wait. The desperation was a physical thing, a pressure behind his ribs. He had to see her. He had to know she was okay. He would figure out the excuse later. He found 417 Westleaf Avenue easily. It was a small storefront, sandwiched between a used bookstore and a shop that sold exotic teas. The windows were dark, but a single light glowed from the back of the space. The sign above the door was new, the letters painted in a familiar shade of stormy blue. The Clay Pot. He stood across the street, shrouded in the deep shadow of an awning, and simply watched. He slowed his system, sinking into the profound stillness that was his nature, and focused his senses. He could hear the quiet hum of a kiln, the soft scratch of a tool against drying clay, and beneath it, a sound he had been aching to hear for 4 days, a steady, living heartbeat. Thump, thump. Thump, thump. Calm, even, focused. She was in there, working. He stayed there for an hour, an invisible sentinel. It was a foolish, reckless thing to do. He was the ruler of this city, a king hiding in the shadows to watch a commoner. It was pathetic, but it was the only thing he could do. A little after midnight, the light in the back went out. A few moments later, the front door opened and she stepped out, locking it behind her. She looked tired. There were smudges of clay on her cheek and in her hair. She wore the same wool sweater he'd seen her in at the market. She pulled a set of keys from her pocket and walked to a beat-up blue sedan parked a few feet down the street. He tracked her scent on the air, clay, turpentine, and the faint, sweet smell that was uniquely hers. He could follow her home. He could learn where she lived, watch over her apartment, ensure her safety from a distance. The thought was both a comfort and a deep violation. It was the instinct of a predator, not a man falling in love. He forced himself to stay put as she drove away, her taillights disappearing around the corner. He had the address of her shop. That was enough. For now. He would have to be Leo. He would have to wait for the moon. The wait, which had before been an inconvenience, now felt like a prison sentence. 26 days. An eternity. The next 3 weeks were the longest of his long life. He became obsessed. He had Alec drive him past her shop every night. He would sit in the dark car a block away and just listen. He learned the rhythm of her days from the sounds that drifted from the shop. The whir of the wheel, the hum of the kiln, the soft rock music she played in the afternoons, the murmur of customers' voices. He knew what time she arrived, what time she left. He knew she talked to herself sometimes when she was working, quiet, frustrated mutterings. He knew that a woman came by most evenings around 8, bringing food and staying to talk, her voice bright and fast and insistent, and that Rowan laughed more when this person was around. A friend. He filed the knowledge away, a piece of her life that existed beyond him, and he was surprised to find it comforting rather than threatening. Julian called him once a week, his voice laced with insufferable pity. "Still holding your vigil, my friend? Have you considered taking up knitting to pass the time? I could send you a pattern for a tea cozy. You could leave it on her doorstep. An anonymous, handcrafted gesture of your silent, brooding affection." Leander always hung up. The day of the full moon finally arrived. A nervous, electric energy coursed through him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in centuries. It was anticipation, pure and simple. He spent the entire day in his penthouse, the blackout curtains drawn, staring at a clock. He had a plan. A flimsy, transparent plan, but a plan nonetheless. As dusk fell, he laid out the clothes. The same faded shirt, the same worn jeans. He was about to summon Alec when the change began. Earlier than usual, and far more violent. A wave of agony seized him, so intense he fell to his knees on the cold marble floor. The thaw was a fire, the returning pulse a jackhammer in his skull. He gasped, his still lungs burning. It felt wrong. It felt like his body was fighting itself, the curse and his nature locked in a vicious battle. When it was over, he was trembling, slick with a cold sweat he shouldn't be able to produce. He was human, but he felt weak, drained. Something was off. The curse had always been precise, a clockwork cruelty. Tonight it had been chaotic. He pushed the thought away. He couldn't let it stop him, not tonight. He found a taxi on the street. He couldn't bear Alec's silent judgment tonight. He gave the driver the address for the clay pot, his voice unsteady. The shop was lit up, a warm beacon on the quiet street. The open sign was still illuminated. His heart, his real, stupid, human heart, was pounding. He took a deep breath, smoothed his shirt, and walked to the door. The bell above the door chimed softly as he entered. The space was warm and smelled of damp earth, cinnamon from the tea shop next door, and something baking. It was bigger than her market stall, but had the same feeling of curated peace. Shelves lined the walls, filled with her work. In the back, he could see a potter's wheel and a large kiln. Rowan was behind a simple wooden counter, wiping it down with a cloth. She looked up when the bell chimed, a polite customer service smile on her face. The smile faltered when she saw him. Her eyes widened in genuine shock. Leo? The way she said his name, a breath of surprise and something else, something he didn't dare name, was worth the entire agonizing wait. "Hi," he said, his voice hoarse. How did you... She stopped, gesturing vaguely around her shop. "I haven't seen you at the market." Here it was, the lie. He had rehearsed it 100 times. He hated it. "I was in the neighborhood," he started, the words feeling clumsy and false in his mouth. "I saw the sign. I thought it had to be you." It was so thin. What were the chances? She looked at him, her head tilted. Her gaze was sharp, intelligent. He could see her weighing his words, the improbability of it. He braced himself for her disbelief, for the suspicion that would shutter her expression. But then she smiled. Not the polite customer smile, but the real one, the one that made her eyes crinkle. Wow, small world. She didn't question it, she just accepted it. The relief was so profound, he felt lightheaded. "I'm glad you found me. I was worried you'd think I just disappeared." "I was," he admitted, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. "I went to the market. Your booth was gone." Her expression softened with sympathy. "Oh, I'm sorry. It was so last minute. This space opened up and I had to jump on it. My friend Sage literally drove the van for me at midnight because the lease started the next day. The last night at the market was a mad scramble to pack everything up." So that's what it was. Not an escape. A new beginning. "This place is great," he said, looking around. "It suits you." "Thanks." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "It's terrifying. I have to pay rent now, and utilities. Sage keeps telling me I need an Instagram strategy, which, honestly, sounds worse than the rent." She laughed, a little nervously. "Can I get you something? I was just about to make some tea." "Tea would be nice," he said, his voice barely a whisper. They sat in 2 mismatched armchairs in a corner of the shop, drinking chamomile tea from mugs she'd declared seconds due to some imperceptible flaw. She told him about the stress of signing the lease, the joy of having her own kiln, the fear that no one would come. He listened, offering quiet murmurs of encouragement. He was a far better listener as Leo. Leander had to actively restrain himself from solving problems. Leo could just be present. It was better than the market. Here, there was no crowd, no time limit imposed by closing hours. It was just them. The world narrowed to this warm, quiet room, the scent of clay, and the sound of her voice. He learned that her full name was Rowan Chase. He learned she'd grown up in Oregon and missed the rain. He learned she had a terrible sense of direction and an encyclopedic knowledge of 90s television. He learned she'd once accidentally signed up for a pottery competition in Japanese and only realized it when she arrived. He learned her best friend Sage was a florist who had a habit of adopting every stray cat in a 4-block radius and was currently at 6. He, in turn, offered fragments of Leo's fabricated life. He was a freelance consultant, he said, which explained his strange hours. He traveled a lot. He was new to the city. Every word was a lie, and every lie felt like a betrayal. "You have so many scars," she said suddenly, her voice soft. She wasn't looking at his face, but at his hands, which were wrapped around his warm mug. A long, pale scar cut across the back of his right hand. He tensed. "Old injuries." "Do they hurt?" she asked, her gaze lifting to his. It was a simple question, but it felt profound. No one had ever asked him that. "No," he said, the answer true for both Leo and Leander. "Not anymore." She just nodded, accepting that, too. She didn't push. She let him have his secrets. The generosity of it made the guilt of his own deception even sharper. He lost track of time. It was the sound of a key in the lock of the neighboring bookstore that startled him back to the present. He glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 4 a.m. "I should go," he said, a familiar ache starting in his chest. "Sunrise. So soon?" She looked genuinely disappointed. "Early day tomorrow," he lied again. He stood, and she walked him to the door. The space between them felt charged, different from the easy distance at the market. Here, in this private space, the air was thick with unspoken things. "I'm really glad you found me, Leo," she said, her hand on the doorknob. "Me too." He wanted to say more. He wanted to tell her that the last 3 weeks had been a special kind of hell. He wanted to tell her that her existence had become the new center of his. But all he could do was look at her, memorizing the way the shop lights caught the gold in her hair. He reached for his wallet. "I should buy something." She put a hand on his arm to stop him. Her touch was warm, firm. "No, not tonight." The tea was on the house. Consider it a welcome. Her hand lingered on his arm for a heartbeat too long. He could feel the warmth of it seeping through his shirt, a stark contrast to the returning chill in his own skin. The change was coming. He could feel the edges of it, the faint pre-tremors of the shift. He had to leave. Now. He pulled his arm away more abruptly than he intended. "Thank you, Rowan, for the tea." He turned and fled, the bell chiming mockingly behind him. He didn't look back. He walked quickly down the street, a cold panic seizing him. The change was coming too fast. The weakness he'd felt earlier, something was wrong with the curse. He managed to make it 2 blocks before his legs gave out. He stumbled into an alleyway, collapsing against a brick wall as the full force of the transformation hit him. It was a storm of agony. His heart hammered violently, then stopped cold. His lungs burned with a final, stolen breath. The world, which had been soft and muffled, exploded into razor-sharp clarity. The hunger roared back to life, a ravenous, aching void. He lay there for a long time, the cold seeping into the pavement beneath him, his system struggling to reassert its ancient equilibrium. The curse had always been precise, predictable. Tonight it had been chaotic, violent, unstable. And in the middle of that pain, a new fear took root. A fear that had nothing to do with his own survival. If the curse was unstable, what would happen to Leo? What would happen to the fragile human connection he was trying to build on a foundation of lies? He couldn't wait for the moon again. He knew it the way he knew sunlight would kill him, not as a thought, but as a fact of his body. The need to see her was constant, a low-frequency hum that undercut everything else. So he went back to her shop as Leander, wearing Leo's clothes and Leo's name, and pretended. It was the most dangerous thing he had ever done, not because of the deception, because of the cost. As a human, being near Rowan was warmth and comfort and the simple pleasure of her company. As a vampire, it was all of those things layered over a minefield. Her heartbeat, inaudible to mortal ears, was a drum in his skull. Her scent, that unique blend of clay and something sweet, carried beneath it the warm copper thread of the blood moving through her. Every time she laughed, her pulse quickened, and the hunger stirred in him like a sleeping animal lifting its head. He could manage it. He had centuries of practice. But there was a cost to that management, a slow drain on his control, like holding a heavy door shut against a rising wind. After 2 hours in her presence, his hands would begin to tremble. After 3, the room would start to narrow, and every sound she made, the scrape of a stool, the tap of a nail against ceramic, would register not as human noise, but as the movements of prey. He always left before the 3rd hour. He always had an excuse ready. He visited twice a week, arriving late after her last customers had gone. They would sit in the mismatched armchairs and talk. He'd learned how to mimic the small physical habits of the living, the rise and fall of his chest, the occasional blink, the way a human shifts their weight. He'd learned how to hold a hot mug of tea he couldn't feel and pretend to sip from it, pressing it to lips that registered nothing but the faintest ghost of warmth. Each visit was a tightrope walk over a canyon of lies. But the alternative, not seeing her, was worse than any risk. Rowan, for her part, seemed to blossom. The terror of her new business venture eased as customers began to find her. She was a brilliant artist, and her work was its own best advertisement. He watched her confidence grow, saw the tired lines around her eyes soften. She laughed more easily. She started treating his late-night visits not as an oddity, but as a welcome routine. "You're my night owl," she told him one evening, as she showed him a new vase she was particularly proud of. It was glazed in the color of a sunset, all fiery oranges and deep purples. "My strange, quiet friend who only comes out after dark." She paused, then laughed at herself. "Sage thinks I've invented you. She says no real man shows up at 11 p.m. to drink tea and talk about glaze chemistry. She wants to meet you. I told her you'd evaporate on contact with a normal social situation." The image was so close to the truth that Leander felt a cold jolt in his chest. "She might be right," he said carefully. "She's wrong about most things," Rowan said, waving a hand. "She named her last cat Breadstick. Her judgment is suspect." He was falling in love with her. It wasn't the poetic, dramatic passion of his long-lost human life. It was a quiet, desperate, and deeply inconvenient reality. It was in the way he found himself cataloging the tiny details of her face, the way his cold, still body felt a phantom warmth when she smiled at him. It was in the fierce, terrifyingly possessive urge he felt to protect her from a world she didn't even know existed. That world, however, was not inclined to ignore him. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A name whispered by one of his informants, Dimitri. An old name from an old rival. A vampire Leander had humiliated in Bucharest a century and a half ago, stripping him of his territory and his progeny. Leander had assumed him long dead, a victim of his own arrogance. Apparently he had survived, and he was in the city, Leander's city. He doubled the patrols, put his network on high alert. He spent his nights sweeping the city, a ghost of vengeance searching for a ghost of the past. He found traces, a string of missing persons in the industrial district, a feeding ground too messy and conspicuous for any of his own coven. Dimitri was here, and he was being deliberately loud. He was sending a message. Leander's visits to Rowan's shop became more fraught. The tightrope felt thinner, the drop longer. He would sit with her, forcing a calm he didn't feel, while every instinct screamed at him to lock her away somewhere safe, somewhere Dimitri could never find her. But he couldn't. She was a human, with a human life, and he was just Leo, her quiet friend. One night, he arrived at her shop to find it dark. A cold dread, sharper than anything he'd felt before, seized him. He reached for the door. It was locked. He pressed his ear to the glass, straining his senses. Silence. No kiln, no music, no heartbeat. He was about to tear the door from its hinges when his phone vibrated. A text from an unknown number. "She looks so peaceful when she works, it would be a shame to disturb her. Your old friend, Dimitri." Attached was a photo. It was Rowan, taken through the window of her shop, her back to the camera, her head bent over the potter's wheel. The photo was time-stamped 2 hours ago. Rage, pure and white-hot, burned through him. The cold, controlled mask of Leander shattered. Dmitri wasn't just challenging his territory. He had found Rowan. He had identified Leander's vulnerability. He wasn't just being loud, he was being precise. He called her number. It was a number he had programmed into his phone after the first night at her shop. A piece of information he had sworn to himself he would never use. It rang 3 times, then went to voicemail. Her voice, bright and cheerful, filled his ear. "Hi, you've reached Rowan. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. Have a great day." He hung up, his hand shaking with a fury that was terrifying in its intensity. He called Alec. "Get the car. Now." He had to find her. And then he had to end Dmitri. Permanently. He found her at home. He had, of course, known her address for weeks, another piece of forbidden knowledge. He stood outside her small apartment building, a modest 3-story walk-up, and listened. Her heartbeat was there, on the 2nd floor. Steady. Calm. She was watching television. She wasn't alone. The second heartbeat was faster, lighter, and accompanied by the bright, insistent voice he recognized from his nights parked outside the shop. Sage. Her friend was there. She was safe. She was not alone. The relief was so potent it made him weak, but the rage remained. Dmitri had crossed a line that had not been crossed in 100 years. He had threatened someone under Leander's protection. It was a declaration of war. He spent the rest of the night hunting. He moved through his city like a wraith, a blur of speed and shadow. He followed the trail of Dmitri's careless feedings, the scent of his arrogance. He found him just before dawn, in an abandoned warehouse by the docks. Dmitri was not alone. He had brought 2 of his own progeny, brutish and young. They were feeding on a homeless man, a messy, brutal affair. Leander did not announce himself. He did not deliver an ultimatum or wait for recognition. He stepped out of the shadows and broke the first fledgling's neck before the creature had time to look up from its meal. The second lunged, feral and stupid with the hunger, and Leander caught it by the throat and drove it into the concrete floor, hard enough to crater the surface. It dissolved before the dust settled. 3 seconds, 2 down. The warehouse was suddenly very quiet. Dmitri stood in the center of the space, blood on his chin, his eyes wide with a shock that curdled quickly into fury. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp way. He had been handsome in Bucharest, too. It hadn't saved him then. "You will leave my city," Leander said. His voice was flat. There was no theater in it, no resonance. It was the voice of a man stating a fact. "You will do it now, and you will forget the name Rowan Chase." Dmitri bared his teeth. "A century in the sewers, Leander. A century of feeding on rats and hiding from the sun in drains. You took everything from me, and now you stand here defending a mortal? A potter?" He spat the word. "You've gone soft, rotted from the inside." "Last chance," Leander said. Dmitri lunged. The fight lasted 4 seconds. Dmitri was fueled by a century of hatred, but hatred made you sloppy. It made you overextend. It made you forget that the man across from you hadn't survived 300 years by being emotional. Leander sidestepped, caught Dmitri's wrist, and redirected his momentum into a concrete pillar. While Dmitri was still processing the impact, Leander drove a piece of shattered rebar through his heart, pinning him to the wall. Dmitri looked down at the metal protruding from his chest. His expression was not one of rage. It was something sadder and more honest. Recognition. "She'll age," he said quietly. "She'll die, and you'll be standing in the dark, alone, exactly where you started." Then he dissolved, leaving nothing but a pile of gray ash and a stain on the concrete. Leander stood in the sudden silence, his chest still, his body thrumming with the aftermath of violence. Dmitri's last words were not a threat. They were a prediction. And predictions, unlike threats, could not be killed. He did not go home. He went to Julian's. Julian lived in a converted cathedral on the east side, a monument to his own aesthetic pretensions. Leander found him in the nave, reclining on a chaise longue, reading a first edition of something French. He looked up when Leander entered, and the amusement drained from his face. "You look like you've been in a fight," Julian said carefully. "Dimitri is dead." Julian set the book down. "Ah." He found Rowan. He sent me a photograph of her, taken through her shop window. Leander stood in the center of the nave, the morning light pressing against the blacked-out stained glass. His voice was very controlled. "He told me he learned about her from you, that you have a loose tongue for the right price." The silence that followed was long enough to have weight. Julian did not look away. He was too old for that. "He had the location of my Sao Paulo safe house," Julian said, "the one where I keep my archive. 300 years of records, Leander. Names, debts, alliances. He said he would burn it unless I told him what you were searching for. Not who. What." He paused. "I told him you were looking for a mortal woman. I did not give him a name. He found the name himself, through the same public records I used. You should have told me." "Yes," Julian agreed. "I should have. I calculated that a man obsessed enough to use my network to find a potter would not react well to being told that his search had been compromised. I calculated wrong." He met Leander's gaze. "I am sorry. It is a thing I say perhaps once a century, so you can trust it is sincere." Leander stared at him for a long time. Julian did not flinch, did not fill the silence with wit or deflection. He simply waited. "If anything happens to her because of information that passed through your hands," Leander said, "our friendship ends. And I don't mean the social pleasantries." "I understand," Julian said quietly. Then, after a pause, "For what it's worth, the Sao Paulo archive is already relocated. Dimitri's leverage is ash, along with Dimitri." Leander turned and left without another word. The sun was rising, pushing him back into the shadows, back into the underground passageways that connected the old buildings of the city. But as he retreated to the safety of his dark penthouse, the cold settled deeper than usual. Dimitri was gone. But the real threat had never been Dimitri. It was the world itself, its randomness, its indifference, its insistence that mortal things must end. He intensified his surveillance, placing invisible sentinels around her shop, her apartment. He was building a fortress of secrecy around her, and she had no idea she was a prisoner in it. Their late-night meetings continued, but the strain was beginning to show. He was distracted, his gaze constantly sweeping the street outside her window. The easy peace between them was gone, replaced by a low hum of anxiety that was entirely his own. Rowan noticed. Of course she did. She was observant, empathetic. "Is everything okay, Leo?" she asked one night, her brow furrowed with concern. "You seem on edge." "Just a lot on my mind," he deflected. "Work." "You work too hard," she said, her voice soft. "Whatever it is you do." She gave him a look. "Sage has a theory that you're a spy. I told her spies don't buy this much pottery. She said that's exactly what a spy would want you to think." She was trying to make him laugh. The kindness of it was unbearable. The breaking point came a week later. It was not a grand, dramatic confrontation. It was something small and stupid and inevitable. Dimitri's death had left a gap in the city's predatory ecosystem. His territory, such as it was, had been unmanaged and chaotic, and the power vacuum attracted strays. A new fledgling, turned by one of Dimitri's progeny before Leander had destroyed them, had been wandering the city for days, half feral, driven by a hunger it didn't understand. Leander's sentinels had been tracking it through the industrial district, but the fledgling was erratic, doubling back, moving in circles. What the sentinels didn't know, what Leander hadn't considered, was that the fledgling was following a scent trail. His scent trail. His other movements through the city were brief and dispersed, a corridor crossed, a rooftop touched, gone in minutes. But Westleaf Avenue was different. 2 months of twice-weekly visits, hours spent sitting in a warm shop, his scent soaking into the brick and the doorframe and the sidewalk, had laid down an olfactory highway that a hungry, desperate creature would follow the way a drowning man follows a current. It didn't know where it was going. It only knew that something powerful had lingered here, And where the powerful lingered, there might be safety, or at least a kill already in progress. Leander was in the shop with Rowan. It was late, just past midnight. She was showing him how to wedge clay, her hands strong and sure as she worked the heavy gray mass on a plaster block. He was standing close, watching her, his guard down for just a moment, lulled by the simple domestic peace of the scene. And then he heard it, a heartbeat, frantic and terrified, just outside the shop. A man's. And then another sound, the low, predatory growl of a hungry vampire. "Stay here," Leander said, his voice suddenly hard. He moved toward the door. "Leo, what is it?" Rowan asked, her hands stilling in the clay. He didn't answer. He looked through the glass of the door. The fledgling had a man cornered in the doorway of the bookstore next door. The man was pleading, his voice a terrified whimper. The fledgling was grinning, its fangs extended, a monster in the making. Leander's hand was on the doorknob when he heard Rowan's voice behind him. "Oh my God." She was at his side, her face pale with shock and horror, staring at the scene unfolding just a few feet away. There was no time for excuses, no time for subtlety. The fledgling was lunging for the man's throat. Leander moved. He didn't think, he reacted. He threw the door open and was across the 10 feet of sidewalk in an instant, a blur of motion that no human eye could follow. He grabbed the fledgling by the neck, his fingers sinking into the soft flesh. The fledgling was strong, but Leander was ancient. He lifted the younger vampire off its feet with one hand, slamming it against the brick wall of the bookstore. The impact cracked the bricks. The fledgling stared at him, its eyes wide with terror and recognition. It saw not Leo, the quiet mortal, but Leander, the city's king, his face a mask of cold, absolute fury. "You are in my territory," Leander said, his voice a low growl that was not human. "And you are poaching." He tightened his grip. There was a sickening crack, and the fledgling went limp. Leander held it for a moment longer, then let it drop. The body hit the pavement and dissolved into a cloud of gray dust that eddied in the streetlight before vanishing. The entire event had taken less than 3 seconds. The man who had been cornered stared, his mouth agape, his eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. He looked from the spot where the fledgling had been to Leander, then scrambled away into the night without a sound. Silence. Leander stood on the sidewalk, his back to the shop. He did not turn around. He could hear it. The single sound in the universe that mattered. Rowan's heartbeat. It was a frantic, terrified drum, a hummingbird trapped in a cage of ribs. Thump, 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 thump. So fast he was afraid it would tear itself apart. He had to turn. He had to face her. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He turned slowly. She was standing in the doorway of her shop, framed by the warm light. Her face was ashen. Her hand was pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that was directed entirely at him. She was seeing him. For the first time, she was truly seeing him. Not Leo. Not the quiet, scarred man. She was seeing the creature that had just moved faster than a camera shutter, the creature that had turned another being to dust with its bare hands. She was seeing the monster. "Rowan," he said. Her name was a plea. She flinched. The small movement was a physical blow. He took a step toward her, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I can explain." "Stay back," she whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step back into the shop, her hand fumbling for the door. "Please, just stay away from me." The door closed between them. He heard the click of the lock. He stood on the empty sidewalk, under the cold glow of the streetlight, and stared at the door that was now a fortress against him. He could tear it from its frame. He could be inside in a fraction of a second. But the lock wasn't the barrier. The fear was. He had saved a man from a monster, only to reveal that he was one himself. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the frantic, terrified beat of her heart. Then, slowly, he backed away, melting into the shadows. He had never felt so cold. He did not go to her shop the next night, or the night after, or the night after that. He gave her space. He gave her silence. It was the only thing he had to offer her. The fortress of surveillance he had built around her was dismantled. He called off his sentinels, told Alec to stand down. She deserved to not be watched, to not be a prisoner. If she was in danger because of it, then he would have to live with that. The greater danger, he now understood, had always been him. The silence was a living entity. It filled his penthouse, his nights, his entire deathless existence. He had survived wars, plagues, and the slow erosion of centuries. He was not sure he would survive this. He spent those 3 nights imagining her. It was a particular kind of torture because his imagination, sharpened by centuries of watching humans, was very good. He could see her locking the shop door, hands shaking, then checking the lock again. Sitting on the floor behind the counter, knees drawn up, replaying what she'd seen. The impossible speed, the casual violence, the dust. He imagined her calling Sage, starting to explain, then stopping, because how do you explain that? He imagined Sage arriving anyway, because that was what friends did, and Rowan saying she was fine, just rattled. A weird thing happened on the street, some kind of fight, and knowing that the lie tasted the way all his lies had tasted. He imagined her lying awake in her apartment, the lights on, staring at the ceiling, asking herself whether the man who drank chamomile tea in her shop had ever been real at all. The worst part was that he didn't know if he was imagining it right. He had no access to her interior life. He never had. He had watched her for months, cataloged her habits, memorized her heartbeat, and he still didn't know what she was thinking. He had treated her like a painting to be studied, rather than a person to be known. And the distance between those two things was exactly the distance between Leander and Leo. On the 3rd night, his phone rang. Her name flashed on the screen. His still heart gave a painful lurch. He answered, his hand unsteady. "Hello? Leo?" Her voice was small, hesitant, not terrified, just uncertain. "Or is that your name?" "It's one of them," he said quietly. "My name is Leander." There was a long pause. He could hear her take a breath. "Can you come to the shop? Are you sure?" "No," she said with a raw honesty that leveled him. "But I think we need to talk, and I'd rather do it before I lose my nerve." He was there in 10 minutes. He didn't use his speed. He took a car, like a man. He walked to her door, like a man. He knocked. She opened it. She was pale, but her gaze was steady. She was wearing her paint-splattered apron as if she had been trying to work, trying to find normalcy in the familiar motions. "Come in," she said, stepping back to let him pass. The shop was the same, warm, smelling of clay, but the air was thick with tension. He stood in the center of the room, aware that his stillness, which he usually masked so carefully, was exposed now. There was no point in pretending to breathe. She didn't speak for a long moment. She just looked at him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, his clothes, his hands. She was looking for the man she knew, and the monster she had seen. "You're both, aren't you?" she said finally. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. The man who drinks tea and buys mugs he doesn't need. And that, what I saw on the street. You're both. He could only nod, his throat tight. Yes. "What are you?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. And so he told her. He told her everything. He started with his name, Leander, and the year he was born. He told her what he was, how he had lived, the nature of his existence. He told her about the curse, about the single night of humanity each month that felt more real than the thousands of nights of his immortality. He told her about finding her stall at the market, a lost, grieving man in a body he barely recognized. He told her about Leo, the fiction he had created so he could be near her. He told her about her disappearance from the market and the desperate, absurd search to find her again. He told her about Dimitri and the threat she never knew she was in. He told her about the non-moon visits, the cost of sitting beside her in his true form, the hunger he had to leash every time she laughed. He left nothing out. He laid the entire, wretched, complicated truth at her feet. He was a king confessing his treason. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. He had given her the power to destroy him, and he knew he deserved whatever judgment she rendered. She walked over to the counter and picked up a mug, one of her seconds. She turned it over and over in her hands, her gaze distant. "So all of it was a lie," she said, her voice flat. "Leo, the consulting job, being new in town?" "The circumstances were a lie," he said, his voice raw. "But what I felt was not. What we had. Here. That was real. For me." She looked up at him, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. "It was real for me, too.
And I'm so angry at you for lying to me. And I'm so terrified of what you are. But," she took a shaky breath, "when you were standing there after that thing was gone, you looked at me. And you didn't look like a monster. You looked like you were afraid you had just lost everything." She put the mug down and walked toward him. She stopped a few feet away, just out of arm's reach. "You run cold, don't you?" she asked. "I always noticed, when our hands would touch. I just thought you had bad circulation." She reached out, slowly, tentatively, and placed her hand on his forearm. Her skin was so warm. It was the same warmth he had felt that first night, but now he understood the difference, the chasm between them. He stood perfectly still, afraid to even breathe, not that he needed to. "You feel like winter," she whispered. She looked from his arm to his face. "Is it always like this, for you?" "Yes," he said. She kept her hand there, her warmth a small, impossible anchor in his cold eternity. "I need time," she said. "I need to think. This is a lot to process." "I know." "But don't disappear again," she said, her gaze fierce. "Don't make that choice for me. We talk. We figure this out, together. And you're going to meet Sage, because if I have to carry this alone, I will lose my mind. And she's already convinced you're a spy, so vampire is honestly a lateral move." Despite everything, despite the ruins of his carefully constructed lies and the raw, bleeding honesty of the moment, he felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It was not a smile. It was the ghost of one, and it was the most real expression his face had worn in 300 years. Their relationship started over. It was slow, cautious. They built it not on the fiction of Leo, but on the complicated truth of Leander and Rowan. She asked questions, thousands of them. He answered every one with unflinching honesty. She learned about the hunger, the logistics of secrecy, the crushing weight of memory. He learned about her dreams of opening a second studio, her complicated relationship with her mother, who thought pottery was a phase that had lasted 15 years, her fear of failure, her inability to cook anything that wasn't toast. He met Sage. It went about as well as could be expected. She'd stared at him for a full 30 seconds, then turned to Rowan and said, "Okay, so he's not a spy. This is worse." Then she'd made tea and asked him very practical questions about sunlight, garlic, and whether he could turn into a bat, and seemed genuinely disappointed when the answer to the last one was no. He showed Rowan his home, the sterile penthouse that was more of a fortress. She looked at the bare walls, the lack of personal effects, and the hidden cabinet with its collection of 13 mugs. She'd picked one up, the first one he'd ever bought, and held it. "A rosary of your humanity," she'd murmured, and he'd been stunned by her perception. She, in turn, started bringing life into his space. A small lopsided vase with a single flower, a throw blanket for a couch he never sat on, a framed photo of the night market that Sage had taken, slightly blurry, the lights streaking like small comets. Small incursions of warmth and color into his monochrome world. He was still careful around her, his movements always controlled, his strength always leashed. But the fear in her eyes was replaced by a cautious curiosity, and then by a deep, quiet acceptance.
The first time she touched him without flinching, a simple hand on his, it felt more intimate than any kiss he had ever known. She was learning to love both the man and the monster. Tonight was the full moon. The change came, and with it, the familiar agony and the blessed release. But the agony was worse than before, sharper. The curse fought his body like a thing with teeth, and when it was over, he lay on the floor of his bedroom for a full minute, gasping, his new heartbeat ragged and uneven. Something was fraying. The curse was not meant to coexist with what he was becoming, a vampire who wanted to be human, who was building a life that required both halves. The magic didn't know what to do with that. It was breaking down. He pushed himself to his feet. He was Leo again, but the name no longer felt like a costume. It was just a part of him, the part that got to be human for a night. They were at the night market. It had been her idea. "We need to reclaim it," she'd said. "It's our place." So here they were, standing in line at the green truck, the air thick with the smell of grilled meat and onions. He ordered the carnitas tacos, messy and glorious. She got a shrimp tostada. They found a bench at the end of the pier, the same one where he had once sat alone. The night was cold, the Pacific a vast, dark expanse before them. But he wasn't cold. Rowan was leaning against him, her head on his shoulder, her warmth seeping into his side. He had one arm around her, holding her close. The simple weight of her against his ribs. The smell of her hair, salt and clay, no longer layered over the copper thread of blood, but just itself. Just her. He took a bite of his taco. It was sublime. He closed his eyes, savoring the taste. "This is still my favorite night," she said softly, her voice muffled against his jacket. He swallowed, a lump forming in his throat that had nothing to do with the food. He looked down at the top of her head, at the strands of her hair catching the distant lights of the pier. He thought of the other 29 days of the month, of the quiet nights in her studio, the hunger he kept on a leash, the way she wasn't afraid of his stillness anymore, of the slow, patient way she was teaching him how to live again, not just survive. "I know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was still learning to name. He pressed a kiss to her hair, breathing in the scent of her. "But I like the other 29 too," he said. She lifted her head and looked at him, her eyes warm and searching. She put her hand against his cheek. It was the simplest gesture in the world, and it unmade him. "Your heart's beating," she said, "for a few more hours." She held his gaze. She didn't look away from what that meant. The hours that would end, the cold that would return, the centuries that stretched ahead of him, and the decades, only decades, that stretched ahead of her. She didn't pretend the math worked. She just held his face in her warm hand and let him feel it. "Then let's not waste it," she said. Somewhere behind them, the market hummed with its weekly chaos. The surf hit the pilings in a slow, patient rhythm. The moon hung full and heavy over the Pacific, the architect of his borrowed humanity, and he could feel it already, the faintest tremor at the edge of his pulse, the first whisper of the cold waiting to reclaim him. The night was not forever. It never was. But her hand was warm on his face, and the tacos were good, and for now, for this one borrowed night, the math didn't matter. He leaned into her touch and closed his eyes and let himself be human. The curse broke on a Tuesday in November. There was no warning. The full moon rose over the city, fat and silver, and Leander waited for the thaw that didn't come. He stood at the windows of his penthouse, watching the light crawl across the floor, and felt nothing. No fire in his fingers, no gasping return of breath, no clumsy, beautiful heartbeat hammering to life in his chest. Nothing. The moon was full, and he was still a vampire. Leo was gone. He drove to her apartment at 4 a.m. She was waiting at her door in an oversized sweater and pajama pants, her hair a mess, her eyes squinting against the hallway light. She looked at his face, and she knew. "It didn't come," he said. "The curse is gone." She was quiet for a long time. Then she stepped forward, put both hands on his face, That gesture, always that gesture, the one that unmade him every time and held him there, her warm palms against his cold skin. He closed his eyes. "Come inside," she said. In her kitchen, she made 2 mugs of tea, one for her, one for him. He couldn't taste it, she knew that. She set it in front of him anyway because the ritual mattered more than the function, and she had always understood that about him better than he understood it about himself. "So no more human nights," she said. "No. No more tacos. No. No more heartbeat." He shook his head. She looked down at her tea. He braced himself. For the speech. For the gentle, devastating logic of a woman who had done the math and found it wanting. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I didn't fall in love with Leo," she said, her voice steady but her eyes bright. "I fell in love with a man who kept coming back, who sat in my shop for 2 hours fighting something I couldn't see just to be near me, who bought mugs he couldn't use and tea he couldn't drink and never once complained, because being there mattered more than being comfortable." She looked up at him. "That wasn't Leo. That was you." He had words for every occasion. He had none for this. "I don't need you to have a heartbeat," she said. "I need you to show up." She reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, his were not. She held on anyway. That night, for the first time, she stayed at the penthouse, not in a guest room, with him. She curled against his side in the vast, empty bed he had never used for sleeping, pressed her face into his shoulder, and wrapped her arm around his chest. He lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, not that he needed to, afraid that any shift would break whatever spell had convinced her this was a place she wanted to be. "You're so cold," she murmured into his shirt, her voice already thick with sleep. "I know, I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." She pressed closer, her warmth bleeding into him like sunlight through glass. "Just stay." He stayed. He held her with a careful, terrified tenderness, his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting on the curve of her waist. He could feel her heartbeat against his ribs, a steady, living percussion that echoed in the hollow of his chest. He counted the beats. He memorized the rhythm. He lay there for 8 hours, completely still, completely present, and watched the night pass over them like a tide. And when she woke in the gray pre-dawn light and looked up at him with those sleep-soft hazel eyes, he thought, "I have survived 3 centuries, and nothing in them was as difficult or as necessary as this single night." "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything. The year that followed was the sweetest of his existence, and the most terrifying. They built a life. Not the life of a man and a woman, something stranger, something that had no precedent. She moved into the penthouse and colonized it the way a forest reclaims an abandoned building. Plants appeared on the windowsills, fed by grow lights she rigged because the blackout curtains stayed drawn until dark. Clay dust settled on surfaces that had once been spotless. A second potter's wheel occupied what had been a guest bedroom. The obsidian desk acquired a coffee ring and a small ceramic owl she'd made as a joke and that he had placed there with absolute seriousness. He learned to cook for her. It was absurd, a vampire in a kitchen, following recipes he couldn't taste, adjusting seasoning by scent alone. But his senses were sharper than any palate, and within a month he could identify the precise moment a sauce reduced to the right consistency by the change in its aroma. She would sit at the counter and watch him, her chin in her hand, a look on her face that he could only describe as delighted disbelief. "You're making me risotto," she said one evening, as if confirming a hallucination. "It needs more parmesan," he said, frowning at the pot. "You can't even taste it. I can smell the difference. It's not ready." She came up behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his back. The warmth of her, the sudden, complete closeness of it, made his hands go still on the wooden spoon. 300 years of survival instincts screamed at him to account for the threat, to catalog the heartbeat, to manage the hunger. He breathed through it, an unnecessary breath, a deliberate one, and let himself feel only her. It's incredible risotto, she said later, scraping the bowl clean. You're a better cook than anyone who can actually eat food. That's either beautiful or deeply unfair. Both, he said, watching her eat with a pleasure that was more satisfying than any meal he could remember from his human life. She touched him constantly. Not dramatically, not performatively, but with the easy, habitual intimacy of a person who had decided that his cold skin was simply part of the landscape of her life. A hand on his arm when she passed him in the hallway, her feet tucked under his thigh on the couch while she sketched and he read, her fingers lacing through his while they walked through the city after dark, her warmth a constant, steady current flowing into his hand. She would press her lips to his knuckles sometimes, absently, the way another person might bite a thumbnail. And each time it happened, Leander, who had outlived the rise and fall of empires, felt his ancient composure crack like ice in spring. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday, 3 months after the curse broke. They were in her shop, late, the kiln cooling behind them. She was telling him about a commission she'd landed. A restaurant wanted a full set of tableware, 60 pieces, her biggest job yet. And her face was flushed with excitement and fear, her hands moving fast as she talked. And he was watching her the way he always watched her, with a focus that bordered on devotion. And she stopped mid-sentence. "You're staring," she said. "I'm always staring," he said. "You've never minded before."
I've always minded. I just liked it. She smiled. He smiled. It was not the ghost of a smile this time, not the careful, controlled twitch he'd been performing for months. It was real, and it transformed his face the way her smiles had always transformed hers, and something in the air between them shifted, tilted, fell. He crossed the distance between them in a single step, a human step, deliberate and slow, and cupped her face in his cold hands. She didn't flinch. She leaned into him. He kissed her, and her mouth was warm and tasted of the chamomile tea she'd been drinking, and the simple, shattering sweetness of it buckled something in his chest that had been locked for 300 years. She pulled back just enough to look at him. Her eyes were bright. "You're freezing," she whispered. "I'm always freezing." "I know." She kissed him again. "I'll warm you up." She couldn't, of course. That was not how it worked. But the trying, the constant, patient, stubborn trying, was its own kind of warmth, and it was the warmth he lived for. Sage gave him a cat. He had not asked for a cat. The orange tabby, named Brick, was deeply unbothered by his nature. It slept on his desk, shed on his suits, and occasionally stared at him with an intensity that suggested it understood exactly what he was, and simply did not care. He found this enormously comforting. The question arrived the way most important things arrived in Rowan's life, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, determined practicality. It was autumn again, a year after the curse broke. They were on the couch, her back against his chest, his arms around her, Brick asleep on the armrest. She was sketching, he was reading. The city glittered silently beyond the glass. "I've been thinking," she said, not looking up from her sketchbook. "About?" "About the fact that I'm going to die." His hand, which had been tracing slow, absent circles on her forearm, went still. "Not today," she added quickly, turning her head to look up at him. "I'm not being dramatic. I mean, eventually. In 40 years, 50 if I'm lucky. And you're going to be here, exactly like this, and I'm going to be gone." He said nothing. The words she was saying were the words he heard every night in the silence of his own mind, the drumbeat beneath every moment of happiness, the shadow behind every kiss. He had never said them aloud. He had not wanted to give them that much power. "I don't want that," she said simply. "I don't want to leave you." "Rowan, let me finish." She set the sketchbook aside and turned to face him fully, pulling her legs up under her. Her expression was the one she wore when she was working through a technical problem with a new glaze, focused, serious, resolute. "I've been thinking about this for months. I've talked to Sage." "Don't look at me like that. She took it surprisingly well." She said, and I'm quoting, "If he can make risotto like that without taste buds, He can probably handle turning you without being weird about it. She's remarkably practical about the supernatural. Sage is remarkably practical about everything, Leander said. His voice was barely audible. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm asking you to let me stay. She took his hand and he felt the warmth of her fingers, the steady pulse in her wrist, the life that moved through her like light through water. I want to stay with you. I want to stay and make pottery and fight about how you alphabetize the spice rack, and watch you pretend to drink tea for the next 300 years. I want to learn to see the world the way you see it. I want to hear the heartbeats and smell the rain from miles away, and I want... Her voice cracked, just slightly. I want to be the one thing in your life that doesn't leave. The silence that followed was immense. It filled the room, the building, the city. It filled 300 years of loss and loneliness and the careful, deliberate emptiness he had built around himself like a fortress. You would lose things, he said, and his voice was raw, stripped bare. The food, the warmth, sleep, growing old, the feeling of the sun. I know. You would gain the hunger, the cold, the stillness, the knowledge that everyone you knew, Sage, your mother, I know. Her grip tightened on his hand. I know what it costs. I've watched you pay it every day for the past year. I'm not naive about this, Leander. I'm making a choice. The same way you made a choice when you walked into that night market with a fake ID and bought a mug you didn't need from a woman who was just trying to sell pottery. You chose me. I'm choosing you back. He looked at her. He looked at the woman who had seen him kill a creature with his bare hands and called him 3 days later. Who had put her warm palm on his cold face and said, "Then let's not waste it." Who had filled his empty fortress with clay dust and laughter and a cat named after a building material. I don't know if I can, he whispered. The confession cost him something. The turning. I've done it before, centuries ago. It's violent, I trust you, she said. 3 words. They leveled him more completely than any weapon forged in 3 centuries of warfare. Okay, he said. Okay? Okay. She laughed, a sound that was half joy and half sob, and she launched herself into him, her arms around his neck, her face buried in his shoulder. He caught her, he would always catch her, and held her with the fierce, precise, trembling care of a man holding the only thing in the world that mattered. I love you, she said into his neck. She said it the way she said everything, directly, without decoration. Like a fact she'd verified and was now reporting. I love you, and I'm going to be really annoyed if you make this weird. I love you, he said. The words felt enormous in his mouth. He had not said them since before Byzantium fell. I have loved you since you told me to try the garlic fries. She pulled back and looked at him, her eyes red, her smile incandescent. That's the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me. And I need you to know that the bar was very low. They chose a night in December, when the air was sharp and the city was quiet. Rowan spent the day saying goodbye to the things she would lose. She ate her last meal, the risotto he made, because she insisted, and a slice of chocolate cake Sage brought over with a card that said, Happy Rebirthday, and a hand-drawn bat that looked more like a deformed sparrow. Sage had stayed for an hour, hugged Rowan so hard the smaller woman squeaked, punched Leander in the arm hard enough to hurt her own hand, and said, If you mess this up, I will find a way to kill you. I don't care that you're immortal. I'll figure it out. Then she'd left, and they were alone. Rowan had called her mother that afternoon. Leander hadn't listened. He'd given her the room, closed the door, stood in the hallway with his hands at his sides. But he'd heard her voice through the wall, thick and unsteady, saying things that sounded like ordinary goodbyes, but weren't. I love you. I'm so proud of the garden. Tell Dad the risotto recipe is in the blue notebook. When she came out, her eyes were red, and she didn't explain, and he didn't ask. Rowan stood at the windows watching the sunset.
the last one she would ever see. The light caught the strands of her hair, gold and warm, and painted her face in shades of amber. Leander stood behind her, close but not touching, giving her the space to feel this loss before it happened. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, and he was not looking at the sunset. She turned to him. Her eyes were calm. She reached up and took his face in her hands, one last time, her warm palms against his cold skin. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him on the pier, on that borrowed night when his heart had been beating, and the tacos had been good, and the math hadn't mattered. She looked at him like he was worth it. "I'm ready," she said. He lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her wrist, where the pulse beat steady and strong. He stayed there for a long moment, breathing her in, clay, cinnamon, and the faint, sweet scent that was hers alone, the scent he would carry with him for the rest of eternity. "I'm going to miss this," he said against her skin. "Miss what?" "Your warmth." She smiled. "Then remember it." He kissed her wrist, and then her palm, and then her mouth, slowly, carefully, as if sealing a promise. Her lips were warm. They would not be warm again. He memorized the temperature, the softness, the taste. He filed it away in the deep archive of his memory, alongside the fall of Constantinople and the smell of garlic fries on a pier, in the cabinet marked "Things Worth Surviving For." Then he turned her. What he did was ancient and intimate, closer than any act of the body, and he would not describe it afterward, not to Julian, not to anyone. Some things belonged only to the two people in the room. It was gentle as much as it could be. He held her through it, through the cold that swept through her like a flood, through the stopping of her heart, through the terrible, ringing silence that replaced its beat. He held her while her breathing slowed and stopped. He held her while the warmth left her skin, degree by degree, until she was as cold as he was. He held her in the silence afterward, two still figures in a room full of clay dust and plants, and the small ceramic owl on the obsidian desk. And he waited. She woke with a gasp. Not of air, she didn't need that anymore, but of sensation. Her eyes flew open and they were different, sharper. The hazel was deeper, shot through with flecks of gold that caught the light like sparks. She looked at the ceiling, at the room, at him, and he watched the world rewrite itself behind her new eyes. "Oh," she breathed, then, louder, "Oh." "What do you hear?" he asked softly. She was quiet for a moment, her head tilted, her expression one of wonder. Everything. The building's electrical system, a dog barking 6 blocks away, someone playing piano somewhere, and... She stopped. She pressed her hand to his chest, the way she always had, searching for the heartbeat that had never been there except 12 nights a year. "Nothing," she said. "Same as you." "Same as me," he confirmed. For a moment, her face crumpled. Not into tears. She couldn't cry anymore, he realized, and the understanding of that hit him like a fist, but into something raw and unguarded. The expression of a woman who had just felt the full weight of what she'd given up. It lasted 2 seconds. Then she breathed, a breath she didn't need, and the steadiness came back, and she was Rowan again. She looked down at her own hand, resting on his chest. Her skin was pale now, cool, the veins no longer visible beneath the surface. She flexed her fingers. "I can feel the threads of your shirt individually," she said, with the tone of someone reporting a scientific discovery. "That's insane." "It gets easier. Can I still make pottery?" He almost laughed. Of all the questions, of all the things she might ask first, about the hunger, about the sun, about the vast and terrifying new reality of her existence, she asked about the clay. "Yes," he said. "You'll need to learn your new strength, but yes." "Good." She sat up, and the movement was faster than she intended. She overcorrected, gripped the edge of the bed, and the wood cracked under her fingers. She looked at the broken frame, then at him, and her expression was so perfectly, absurdly Rowan, half embarrassment, half fascination, that the laugh he'd been holding back escaped. She stared at him. "Did you just laugh?" "Apparently. I've never heard you laugh." Her new eyes were luminous. "Do it again." "I don't think it works on command." "Then I'll just have to keep breaking your furniture." She grinned, and even with the new pallor and the sharper angles of her face, it was her grin, the real one, the one that made her eyes crinkle. He pulled her to him, and she came, and for the first time in 300 years, Leander held someone who was as cold as he was, as still as he was, as permanent as he was, and the absence of warmth between them was not a loss. It was a kind of symmetry. Two cold things pressed together, making something that was not warmth but was, perhaps, something better. Something that would last. "Welcome to the long night," he said into her hair. "Is it always this loud?" she murmured against his shoulder. "You get used to it." "Do you get used to the hunger?" "Yes." "I'll teach you." "Will you teach me everything?" "Everything I know." She pulled back and looked at him, and in her new, ancient eyes he saw something he had not seen in 300 years of looking into mirrors. He saw himself, reflected back. And the man in her eyes was not a monster, not a king, not a ghost haunting the edges of the living world. He was just a man who had found his way home. "I'm hungry," she said. "I know. We'll deal with that. And I'm going to need new mugs, the whole collection. I want to re-experience them with these senses." "All 49? 50. I want to make a new one. The first one of this life." She held up her hands, strong, precise, capable. The same hands that had shaped clay under warm-toned bulbs on a coastal pier, and looked at them with an expression of fierce, quiet determination. "I'm going to make us matching mugs. For the tea we can't drink." He took her hands in his, cold meeting cold, still meeting still. And yet somehow the gesture was alive with everything it had always carried: the night market, the garlic fries, the 12 moons, the locked door, the truth, the choice. "I would like that," he said. I seem later, on a shelf in the penthouse, beside 49 mugs in every shade of stormy blue and ocean green. 2 new mugs sat side by side. They were simple, heavy, and glazed in a color Rowan had never achieved before. A deep, shimmering black that caught the light and threw it back in fragments, like the surface of the sea at night. She had stayed up until dawn making them, learning the new calibration of her hands, the strength she had to rein in, the steadiness that came not from muscle memory, but from something older and deeper. They were, she declared, her best work. The first work of her second life. Leander picked one up and turned it over, the way he'd turned over that first mug on the pier, a lifetime ago. The ceramic was cool in his hand. Everything was cool now. But he could hear the faint, crystalline ring of the clay, and he could smell the kiln smoke still trapped in the glaze. And he could see, with his ancient eyes, the tiny imperfections where her new hands had pressed too hard, or not hard enough. The evidence of a woman learning to be what she'd chosen to become. He set the mug down next to its twin. They looked right together. 2 dark things, side by side, catching the light. The clay pot was still open, but its hours had shifted. Evening only, by appointment and walk-in, the sign repainted in Sage's blocky handwriting. Sage ran the daytime front now, answering emails, managing the kiln schedule, handling the customers who came during the hours Rowan could no longer occupy. She came by the penthouse every Thursday. With dinner she insisted on eating in front of them, because someone in this apartment should chew. And she never once treated the situation as anything other than a logistical problem to be solved. She was, Leander thought, the bravest person he had ever met, and he had met a great many. Rowan appeared behind him, silent on her new feet. She was still getting used to that, the soundlessness, and it delighted her, and slid her arms around his waist. She rested her chin on his shoulder. Her skin was cool against his, the same temperature, the same stillness. 2 clocks stopped at the same hour. "Not bad for a dead woman," she said. "Not bad at all." She pressed her lips to his neck, and the kiss was cold, and it was everything. Outside, the city hummed its endless, indifferent song. Somewhere, the ocean was hitting the pilings of a pier where a night market set up every week, where a woman had once sold pottery under a string of warm-toned bulbs, and a man with a borrowed heartbeat had bought a mug he didn't need and fallen in love with the only person who had ever looked at him and seen both the monster and the man, and chosen to stay. The mugs sat on the shelf, side by side, catching the light. They would be there for a very long time.